I went to the restaurant with my parents and saw, at the next table, a strange man caressing my wife. In that instant, everything around me lost color and sound, as if someone had ripped the air from my lungs and placed my heart in an invisible press. Shame and pain mingled, burning my skin as if I had been exposed naked in front of everyone. I didn't make a scene, I didn't ask anything, I didn't demand an explanation. I simply stood up, my legs feeling as heavy as lead, and walked out the door, leaving behind not only dinner but a lifetime by her side. Every step I took seemed to tear a piece of me away, but I still kept walking, as if my body knew that if I stopped for even a second, I would fall to the ground and never get up. In the days that followed, the house was quieter than a cemetery. The space she'd occupied was still there, intact, but empty of soul. Her clothes were still folded in the closet, her perfume still clung to the sheets, and it was like sleeping next to a ghost I still loved but had already departed. Friends would call, asking if everything was okay, and I'd reply with an "I am," which was the worst told lie in history. And inside, there was only a hole. A hole where once there had been a future, plans, laughter in the kitchen, lazy Sundays in bed. Now, there was only the echo of unanswered questions. I didn't need witnesses to understand what I saw. It wasn't just an innocent touch. It was intimacy. It was the kind of touch that only belongs to those who have crossed the barrier of trust and entered forbidden territory. Why? This question tormented me night after night. What could have led the person I trusted most in the world to choose another embrace? The truth is, no answer would suffice. There is no justification for the poison of betrayal, no explanation that can undo the image etched in my mind like an open scar. In the months that followed, I learned the weight of loneliness. At first, it felt unbearable, as if each morning were another prison sentence. But little by little, I rebuilt my peace, brick by brick, until I realized it was still possible to breathe without it. I went for runs just to feel the wind on my face, I signed up for things I'd always wanted to do but never did, and I began to remember what life was like before it. A life that, ironically, was lighter than I remembered. It was during this time, when my heart was no longer bleeding so much, that I met another woman. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't love at first sight. But there was something about her that disarmed me, the way she listened to me without rushing, the way she laughed with her whole body, the way she held my hand not to guide me, but to accompany me. She didn't fill the void left by the other, she showed me that emptiness could be a space for new things. With her, I learned that loyalty isn't a luxury, it's a requirement. And for the first time, I began to believe that perhaps I wasn't defined by the wound I received, but by the scar I managed to carry with dignity. Fate, however, has a cruel talent for testing our strength. Just when I was certain the past had stayed where it belonged, my doorbell rang. Upon opening it, I found my ex-wife, her eyes red and her face streaked with tears. She begged for a second chance, saying she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, that she loved me, and that she'd do anything to get back what we'd lost. With every word that came out of her mouth, I was tempted to believe her, to give in to nostalgia, to reclaim what had once been beautiful. But the truth is, what she asked for no longer existed. What she destroyed couldn't be rebuilt with promises. I forgave her. Not for what she deserved, but for what I deserved. Forgiving meant cutting the last thread that bound me to that pain. But forgiving didn't mean going back. I had already found true love, a love that needed no excuses to exist. And so, each went their own way, bearing the weight and lessons of their own choices. She, forever carrying the regret of having exchanged something unique for a momentary illusion. I, with the clear conscience that I hadn't let the worst of me win. But there's something she never knew. Something that happened one silent night, months after the end, that changed everything forever. Something that made her finally understand the true price of what she lost. And it's at this point that the story stops being just about betrayal and becomes about destiny, justice, and how, sometimes, life gives everything back, in ways no one expects. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is accepted or romanticized. All stories are fictional and carry a single message, to show how infidelity destroys lives, erodes bonds, and extinguishes loves that could last forever. Get ready, because now you're about to hear an intense, moving, and shocking story. The gentle warmth of the afternoon seemed to blend with the soft laughter echoing through the backyard. Lucas sat on his porch, watching the leaves slowly move in the breeze, while he made coffee for himself and Emily. The scene was almost a ritual between them, she, barefoot propped up on the chair, reading a random book, and he, busy taking care of the little details he knew would make her smile. From their first meeting, there was a silent connection between them, an understanding that needed no explanation. When they met, Lucas felt he had found someone who spoke the same language as him, not only in words, but in gestures, pauses, and glances. Emily, with her calm yet curious manner, had become not only the woman he shared his bed with, but also his best friend and confidant. They lived in a simple but vibrant house, where every corner held a story. The sofa was worn from watching too many movies together, the kitchen was constantly filled with the scent of Emily's improvised recipes, and the garden, where Lucas planted flowers and herbs, even if they didn't always grow as expected. On weekends, they would walk through the park, talking about future plans and past memories. They weren't the kind of couple who needed grand adventures to feel happy, what truly mattered was each other's presence, that feeling of being in exactly the right place. Lucas had a steady job, though it required a few more hours than he'd like. Still, he found time to get home before sunset, believing that was when life was most beautiful. Emily worked in design, a talent that transformed ordinary spaces into cozy, personality-filled spaces. Her office was just a few blocks from home, allowing her to be almost always nearby. Sometimes he'd pick her up late in the afternoon, and she'd run to the car with that smile that erased any tiredness he felt. At gatherings with friends, Lucas and Emily were seen as an example of a balanced couple. He was attentive, a good listener, and appreciated her every small achievement. She, in turn, exuded confidence and lightheartedness, making everyone around feel good. Between them, there were inside jokes, phrases only the two of them understood, quick glances that communicated more than any conversation. When they argued, it was never about anything serious. A sincere apology was enough, and everything returned to normal. This harmony gave the impression that nothing could shake what they had built. Lucas's parents loved Emily as if she had always been family. At Sunday dinners, she would help in the kitchen, laughing at her father-in-law's old stories and exchanging knowing glances with her mother-in-law. Emily, even without many relatives nearby, had found a safe haven in his parents, someone she could count on besides her husband. These relationships were an essential part of their balanced life, as if their lives had reached a perfect point of stability. Even so, Lucas knew that routine could be treacherous. So, every now and then, he planned little surprises. A short trip to the beach, a note hidden in her purse, dinner at a new restaurant. It wasn't about luxury, but about care. And Emily always responded with the same affection. One time, he came home to find a box of photos of special moments she had organized on the table. They spent hours reliving memories, laughing at their strange outfits, and reminiscing about their first trips. Their home reflected their feelings, every detail had a reason for being there. There was a painting they bought at a flea market early in their marriage, an antique armchair inherited from a friend, and a crooked lampshade Emily insisted on keeping because, she said, it had character. In the bedroom, the walls were a soft tone, and the curtains let in just enough light to create a cozy atmosphere. In the closet, their clothes intermingled, as if there were no boundaries between what belonged to one and the other. Lucas believed that happiness wasn't found in grand milestones, but in the sum of small moments. A hot coffee on a cold morning, the touch of hands under the table at dinner, the feeling of falling asleep listening to her breathing. Emily, for her part, seemed to agree. There were days when they simply sat on the couch, in silence, each with their own thoughts, and yet they still felt complete. This ability to be together without needing to fill the space with words was one of the pillars of their relationship. However, as stable as their life seemed, there were times when Lucas noticed a certain distance in Emily's gaze. It wasn't frequent or obvious, but enough to make him wonder what was going on. Sometimes she seemed lost in thought, staring out the window as if searching for something beyond what they had. He, accustomed to respecting her space, didn't insist on asking, believing that if something was wrong, she would tell him. Maybe it was just fatigue or worry about work, he told himself, pushing away any uneasy feeling. At work, Lucas was respected for his dedication and calm way of resolving conflicts. He knew how to separate his professional and personal life, which allowed him to come home feeling unburdened by the day. Emily, on the other hand, was more immersed in creativity and tight deadlines, which sometimes required her to work late into the night. Lucas understood and even helped when he could, making tea or adjusting the lighting to make her feel comfortable. To outsiders, they were a solid couple, the kind that inspires comments like, "They were made for each other." Even on social media, where many try to sell an image that doesn't reflect reality, they seem genuine. Candid photos, loving captions, and travel memories fueled this impression of stability. Few would have imagined that, like any couple, they also faced silent doubts and fears. There was a restaurant they'd frequented since the beginning of their relationship, a small but cozy place with wooden tables and dim lighting. There, they'd celebrated birthdays, professional milestones, and even reconciled minor arguments. It was the kind of place that held a part of their history. Lucas felt that this place represented the essence of their relationship, simple, intimate, and full of memories. Time passed, and even with commitments and routines, they found ways to keep their connection alive. Emily sometimes left hidden notes in his coat pocket, while Lucas organized surprise dinners on dates with no particular significance, just to break the routine. These seemingly small gestures were what kept the flame of their relationship alive. But, silently, something was beginning to form. Not an abrupt rupture, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift that seeped into ordinary days. An unspoken word here, a look that lingered a second too long there. Lucas didn't know it, but the balance he so valued was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. And while he believed he was living in tranquility, fate was already preparing the pieces that would soon forever change the landscape he knew so well. Lucas woke that morning feeling a strange weight in the air, as if the day carried a silent tension he couldn't explain. The sun filtered through the bedroom curtains, creating golden streaks on the floor, but not even that familiar light seemed enough to dispel the uneasy feeling growing inside him. Emily was still asleep, her body wrapped in the blanket, and Lucas watched her for a moment, trying to remember the last time they'd talked at length, laughed late into the night, or simply been together without a cell phone or a work deadline interfering. There were days when he felt as if she were somewhere far away, even though she was just inches away. Breakfast was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Emily was quieter than usual, stirring the sugar in her cup mechanically, her gaze lost. Lucas asked her simple questions about her day, and she responded with short sentences, accompanied by a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed this disconnect, but he'd learned to respect the moments when she seemed lost in thought. Deep down, however, something in him was beginning to grow uneasy, as if the apparent calm were merely a thin curtain hiding something deeper beneath. Over the weeks, Emily's schedule began to subtly shift. She'd say meetings were later, deadlines required overtime, and professional meetings stretched beyond their intended duration. Lucas, trusting her, accepted her explanations without question, though a part of him retained every detail of these new patterns like someone unconsciously collecting puzzle pieces, unsure of the final image. Sometimes he'd text late into the night and take a while to get a response, and when he did, they were short, accompanied by a "I was busy" that, while plausible, left a shadow of doubt. The relationship continued to have good moments, but the thread that held them together seemed stretched thinner, as if too much tension could snap at any moment. Lucas tried to compensate for this feeling by investing more time and attention, organizing dinners, suggesting outings, but he realized she wasn't always truly present. Emily smiled and chatted, but there was a subtle distance in her gaze, as if part of her were elsewhere. One night, when Lucas arrived home early from work, he found the house empty. At first, he didn't think it was strange, knowing she had plans, but he noticed something different. The blue dress she usually wore on special occasions was no longer on the hanger. In the bathroom, perfume and makeup were scattered in a hurry. He glanced at his watch and wondered where she had gone, but decided not to care. He made some coffee and sat in the living room, waiting, but Emily arrived late, claiming she had gone to a last-minute event. Her tone was firm, but something about the way she looked away left Lucas with the feeling that wasn't the whole truth. The following days were a series of small signs. Her cell phone, which had previously been left lying on the table, now remained constantly within reach. Her messages, answered almost instantly, were accompanied by a faint smile that disappeared when he approached. There was also the scent of perfume he didn't recognize, soft but persistent, permeating the air when she arrived. Lucas tried to push these thoughts away, telling himself that their love was too solid to be shaken by unproven suspicions. One Saturday night, Lucas's parents suggested a family dinner. Emily seemed hesitant, but agreed. They arrived at the familiar restaurant, the one that held so many memories, and sat at a table near the window. The conversation flowed naturally, between laughter and old stories, until something caught Lucas's attention. Nearby, at a smaller, more discreet table, a man was intimately touching the hand of a woman with her back to him. It was a natural, almost routine gesture, but charged with an intimacy that was unmistakable. It didn't take long for Lucas to recognize her hair, the way she tilted her head, the blue dress. The air seemed to drain from the room, and the sounds of the restaurant became muffled, as if someone had flipped an invisible switch that silenced everything around him. His heart pounded, and each second dragged on as if time were stuck. His first reaction was denial, as if his mind was trying to find alternative explanations, but there was no room for doubt. It was Emily. Sitting across from another man, with a smile Lucas knew well, the smile that had always been reserved for him. He remained motionless for a few moments, unsure whether to stand, scream, or simply turn away. The voices around him grew distant, and every heartbeat sounded too loud. He felt a mixture of anger, shame, and a profound sadness spreading throughout his body. In that moment, everything he believed to be intact shattered before his eyes. The life he had imagined safe and secure was being dismantled, piece by piece, by the one he trusted most. With a slow movement, he left his napkin on the table and stood. He didn't say a word. He didn't look back. He walked to the door, crossing the room as if he were in an endless corridor. Each step seemed to drag with it years of stories, trust, and promises. Outside, the cool night air hit his face, but it wasn't enough to ease the pressure in his chest. As he walked away, he felt something fundamental had changed forever. It wasn't just about losing someone, but about losing the certainty of who that person truly was. And in the silence of the walk, he realized that, as much as he wanted answers, perhaps none of them would be able to fill the void that now opened up. What he didn't yet know was that what he saw that night was only the beginning of something much bigger, and that the full truth was yet to come, carrying with it an impact that would change not only his view of Emily, but of everything they had experienced together. Lucas hadn't spoken to Emily again since the night at the restaurant. The silence between them had become a high, cold wall where bridges once stood. He didn't ask for explanations, didn't want to hear excuses, but he also didn't close the door forever. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was just fatigue, but something in him told her that if she wanted to talk, she would have to find the courage to face the truth bluntly. Days passed until, one rainy night, she appeared at the door. She was makeup-free, her hair tied up haphazardly, and her gaze held a mixture of fear and need. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but then made way. She entered slowly, as if treading sacred ground that no longer belonged to her. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, listening only to the sound of the rain beating against the windows. Emily held a mug he'd placed in her hands, but she seemed more focused on finding the right words than on taking a sip. When she began to speak, her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if confessing were a physical effort. She said she knew she had no excuses, that what she'd done couldn't be erased, but that there was something he needed to know. Lucas kept his gaze fixed on her, unhurried, but with the tension of someone who senses that the truth to come may be worse than anything he could imagine. Emily took a deep breath before continuing. She explained that the man he'd seen her with wasn't someone she'd recently started a relationship with, but rather someone who had been a hidden part of her life for longer than Lucas could have imagined. It wasn't a sudden crush or an isolated slip-up, but a reunion with someone who, according to her, represented a settling of accounts with an unresolved past. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a pressure in his chest, but remained silent. It was then that Emily revealed what he never expected to hear: the man was her first boyfriend, someone she had abruptly broken up with before meeting Lucas, and who, in recent months, had been insisting on reconnecting with them. She said that, at first, she had rejected any advances, but that, in a moment of fragility, she began responding to messages. She said she didn't want to lose Lucas, but at the same time, she was unable to definitively sever that bond. And so, little by little, the conversations turned into meetings, and the meetings into something that could no longer be called simple friendship. Lucas kept his expression composed, but inside he felt a devastating mix of anger and disappointment. It wasn't just the physical betrayal that hurt, but the realization that, while he believed he was living a fulfilling love, she was sharing her attention, energy, and emotions with another man. He asked, his voice controlled, why she hadn't simply told him she still had unfinished business from the past. Emily replied that she was afraid he would see her as someone who still harbored feelings for someone else, and deep down, she knew that if she told him, he would pull away. The conversation grew more intense. Lucas asked if she had ever considered the consequences, what she would lose if she were discovered. Emily, with tears in her eyes, confessed that she thought she could keep things under control, as if there were a way to balance two lives without either falling apart. She said that every time she returned home after being with the other, she felt the weight of guilt, but at the same time, she felt an addiction to reliving something that belonged to an earlier phase of her life. Lucas ran his hand over his face, trying to contain the whirlwind of thoughts. He remembered all the moments he'd sensed a distance in her, all the excuses about work, all the messages she'd replied to with a hidden smile. Now it all fell into place, cruelly. He said what hurt him most wasn't the presence of another man, but the fact that, instead of fighting for what they had, she'd chosen to feed an old story that should have ended by now. Emily reached out, trying to touch his hand, but he recoiled. There was no more room for that gesture. She insisted, saying she wanted to fix everything, that she had completely cut off contact with the other man, that she had realized too late that Lucas was the person she truly wanted to be with. But he, with a firm and calm tone, replied that the problem wasn't just the mistake, but the fact that she had risked everything for something that, deep down, she knew had no future. There was a moment when they simply stared at each other, as if searching in their eyes for a trace of what they once were. Lucas realized that, although there was still affection, there was no longer trust. And without trust, everything else became too fragile to sustain. Emily wept quietly, as if she understood she had lost something irreversible. He stood firm, not for lack of pain, but because he knew that, from that moment on, any step toward her would be a denial of everything he believed about himself and about love. It was in that moment, in the heavy silence that followed the last word, that Lucas realized there was nothing more to say. He turned and opened the door, not as if to expel someone, but as if to give someone back the freedom to move on, even if it meant leaving them alone with their choices. Emily hesitated, looked at him one last time, and left. The door closed slowly, but the sound seemed to echo like a chapter closed forever. What Lucas didn't imagine was that, despite all the pain, that conversation hadn't yet revealed the whole truth. Because the man Emily had been involved with was not only part of her distant past, but also held an unexpected role in the present that she had never had the courage to confess until that moment. And this final part of the story would be the most unexpected and definitive blow of all. The rain persisted through the early hours of the morning, and he barely slept, pacing from room to room as if avoiding the mirror. When the sky cleared gray, the doorbell rang again, low and insistent, and he knew, even before opening the door, that she had returned not out of stubbornness, but because she'd lacked courage the night before. Emily entered with a care that felt like belated respect, her fingers intertwined, her gaze sweeping the room as if searching for the memory of what had once been home to her. Lucas didn't ask her to sit down, but placed a glass of water on the coffee table, and the silence at first seemed like an agreement, until she took a deep breath and her voice came out different, deeper, as if she were ready to finally press her forehead against the ground of truth. She said the story she'd told wasn't complete, that she'd held back the most shameful part because she feared what that word might do to what remained of her dignity, and he, without moving a muscle, simply replied that he no longer had room for half-retelling. There was a second when she closed her eyes, as if asking for permission, and then she spoke without hesitation. That night at the restaurant, it wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't bad luck to run into him there, it was planned, it was carefully chosen, it was premeditated to hurt, it was a cowardly way out to avoid having to face an honest conversation. She said she knew Lucas's parents were going to dinner there, she'd seen an unassuming message on her mother-in-law's phone during coffee, a comment along the lines of, "Reservations at 8, let's get there early," and that, in a moment of weakness that now burned her, she accepted the other man's suggestion to go there, right then, so that the shock would resolve for her what she hadn't had the courage to say. The last word came almost breathlessly, one apology piled on top of another, and the room seemed to shrink. Lucas rested his hands on the back of the sofa, as if needing something firm to keep from shaking inside, and took his time answering. The sound of the wall clock grew stronger, each second a click, and when he finally opened his mouth, he didn't scream, didn't break anything, didn't ask for an explanation, simply articulated with a calm that hurt that the worst part wasn't being betrayed, it was being led onto the scene like an extra in a cheap theater, it was being used as a ladder for her to climb over her own guilt, it was realizing that respect, the thing that kept the walls standing even in storms, had been abandoned. Emily tried to move forward, her hands outstretched in the air, saying she was sick with regret, that the image of him getting up and leaving haunted her every day, that that choice was the lowest point of her life and that nothing justified it, that she wasn't seeking forgiveness to return, but so he wouldn't carry the lie that it had all been a futile whim, but rather a shipwreck of courage. He nodded, a tiny gesture, an acknowledgement that hearing the truth comes at a price, and the truth has cuts that lies never had. He asked her if the other man knew she was boasting about having displayed him as a trophy of rupture, and she replied that there was no boasting at all, there was fear, there was a selfish desire to shorten a path she didn't know how to tread, there was cowardice in having chosen shock over conversation. Then he said that cowardice, in that case, had a face and a date, and that he would never set foot in that restaurant again by choice, not because of the place, but because of the echo. When the door closed, the rain had turned to drizzle, and for days Lucas didn't speak of it to anyone. At night, he ran until he was exhausted, let his lungs burn, and returned home with trembling legs and a slightly calmer head. He accepted invitations he'd previously declined, drank coffee with old friends, listened to stories that shook him off balance for a few minutes, and, in one of these unpretentious encounters, he met Sophia. It wasn't a bolt from the blue, nor a promise spoken too soon. It was a meeting of rhythms. She spoke with eye contact, her gestures calm, and a humor that appeared in the cracks between her sentences. And when she noticed him habitually taking his cell phone out of his pocket to check it, she said with firm gentleness that no one finds peace inspecting ruins, and he put the device away like someone harboring a fever. They began to share little things, the route to work, the same park bench, a recipe that worked, a silence that didn't bother him. He didn't see himself cured, but he saw himself alive, and that was more than he expected. The invitation to a mutual friend's wedding arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and Lucas read the names with a bittersweet sense of past and present. Sophia laughed when he told him about old stories with her fiancé, about impromptu late nights, and said she'd love to go, as long as they promised to dance at least one whole song without thinking about anything. He smiled, accepted the bargain, and when night fell, the hall was bathed in warm lights, glasses clinking, voices mingling in a chorus reminiscent of effortless joy. Little by little, familiar faces, long hugs, and memories were brought to the table. Sophia blended in with the naturalness of someone who doesn't force a place, and this, for Lucas, had a sweet weight, the realization that he no longer needed to explain his own home to anyone, just open the door. It was in the middle of a toast that he spotted her. Emily stood a few feet away, wearing a discreet dress, her hair tied back, the posture of someone trying to fit into the corner of the photo. The first glance was a silent shock, but not an abyss. There was a clean distance there, built with time and truth. She hesitated, raised her hand in a brief greeting, and he returned it with the same measure, without excess, without harshness. Sophia noticed, asked quietly if everything was okay, and he replied yes, that the past sometimes passes by to see if you've learned to look forward, and she, without further questions, squeezed his hand back. The band began a set of classics, and as the first notes of that song that had once symbolized another time emerged, a gaze crossed the room and landed on Lucas, as if fate were testing his spine. He looked at Sophia, raised his eyebrow in a silent question, and she smiled with a gesture that combined delicacy and confidence, telling her with her eyes that no ghost would be able to steal what they were building. He led her to the dance floor, and the two found their own rhythm. No choreography, no grandiose words, nothing that required an audience. It was just a proper embrace, a step to the left, another to the right, and the feeling that finally there was music in their bodies. In the background, Emily watched. Her chin firm, her hands clutching her bag, her chest heavy with an understanding that no speech could convey. That song was no longer a reliquary of two, it had quietly moved house, it had found another heart to echo. It was then that a small commotion near the stage drew attention. The master of ceremonies received a note, the band lowered the volume, someone took the microphone, and, in an announcement that sounded improvised but carefully rehearsed, called to the center of the room a face Lucas recognized as a sharp edge to his stomach. The man he'd seen Emily with at the restaurant took the stage with a young woman in an ivory dress and blazing eyes. In a brief, confident speech, he thanked everyone for coming, praised the bride and groom, spoke of how fortunate it was to witness love, and, with a practiced smile, announced his own engagement to the groom's sister, to applause that erupted like fireworks. Lucas shook Sophia's hand firmly, not out of belated jealousy, but out of a long-standing discomfort that suddenly found a final explanation. Emily, still as a breathing statue, put her hand to her mouth. There was no scandal, no scream, just a cruel understanding. She had not only lost the marriage she had, but she had also abandoned any narrative of return, because the person she had burned bridges for had already started building another house on another street, and hadn't even thought to warn her. After the applause, small circles formed, congratulations, toasts, laughter. Emily stood still for longer than was natural, and then made a decision that was perhaps the most dignified of the night. She walked up to Lucas. The proximity was awkward, but respectful. She asked for 2 minutes, a phrase that barely lingered, and Sophia, with the same elegance as their first meeting, nodded and stepped back a few steps, not like someone abandoning the field, but like someone trusting their own team player. Emily breathed, searched for unvarnished words, said she knew the humiliation fate had just dealt her and that she wasn't looking for consolation, she simply needed to be thankful he hadn't returned evil for evil when he learned of the restaurant's plan, that it haunts her dreams, and that seeing that announcement in front of everyone hurt, but it hurt the way it perhaps needed to hurt. Lucas replied that no other person's pain could erase his own, but that he wished nothing for her other than a chance to look in the mirror without falling apart, and that everyone had to pay their own conscience bills. She nodded, her eyes shining with a thread, and then lifted her face to ask the question that still weighed on her, if he, somewhere in his heart, had kept something beyond the scar. He thought long enough not to be too cruel or generous, and said he retained respect for the good times and care for what was broken, but that love, the kind that changes destiny, no longer lives here. The man from the stage descended, greeting people, and when he passed Emily, he displayed the embarrassment typical of someone who prefers practicality to explanations. She stared at him for a second, and the conversation that followed didn't need loud audio to hurt. She asked if his fiancée knew the story, if he intended to confess, if he even acknowledged the role she had played in the bridge to that announcement. He, with the polite smile worn at parties, said that the past is only past when we learn from it, that he was trying to do the right thing, that she deserved someone who would put her at the center, not behind the scenes of big decisions, and that he hoped one day she would thank him for not going ahead with a bigger lie. Emily remained silent for a few seconds, as if his words, though harsh, had opened a window of real air. Then she said she didn't need his blessing to start over, thanked him for finally seeing herself without a script, and left before anyone took pity. Lucas returned to the dance floor where Sophia was waiting, and there was a different kind of conversation, the one without a microphone. She asked, without playing games, if he wanted to leave or stay a little longer. He replied that he wanted to stay, dance more, toast to the love that was being built without hiding, and she, with a short kiss, said that this was the kind of answer worth years of therapy. They danced to another song, laughed about the stumble on the carpet, and even toasted with water, because what mattered wasn't the drink, it was the clarity. And as they spun slowly, Lucas realized that that night, which could have been another chapter of inherited pain, had become a rite of passage. The truth had been told, the past had taken its final bow, and a new place was opening up. As the party quieted down, Emily disappeared without saying goodbye. Outside, the early morning air was cool, and the street, still wet from the rain, reflected lights in puddles like small mirrors. She walked to her car, feeling the wavering weight of what had been and what would never be. She considered calling someone, but there was no one who could translate that mixture of loss and relief. Loss of what she had destroyed with her own hands, relief at having escaped a story that would never be hers entirely. She got in, rested her head on the steering wheel for a few seconds, and when she looked up, she didn't cry with anger, she cried with clarity. She knew she would need to unearth, piece by piece, the moment she chose to hurt instead of speak, and that this cannot be resolved with public statements or hasty new beginnings. And, for the first time, perhaps, she saw the line between regret and the desire to repair, and understood that the latter requires silence, time, and work. Hours later, already at home, Lucas received a short message from Sophia, a simple, "I liked dancing with you," followed by a ballet shoe emoji that made him smile alone in the kitchen. He replied with another simplicity that spoke volumes, "I liked dancing in peace." And it was this detail, the peace, that became the cornerstone of what was to come. Because no euphoria can replace the security of knowing you're in a place where you won't be forced to watch your own life from the outside. The phone vibrated again. It was his newlywed friend sending a photo showing Lucas and Sophia in the background, laughing crookedly, blurry, but recognizable. He saved the image without ceremony and, for the first time in a long time, felt like he'd saved a photo because he wanted to, not because he was afraid of forgetting. The next day, 2 envelopes arrived almost simultaneously, one with a thank you card from the bride and groom, the other with a letter from Emily, a few lines, no adjectives, no promises, just a request for forgiveness, no demands, and a final, belated confession that closed the cycle of secrecy. Besides the restaurant date, she had written and deleted dozens of messages to confess beforehand, and in each of them, she failed to send them not for lack of remorse, but for fear of losing the image of a good person she had maintained for years, and which that night shattered before his very eyes. Lucas read it, not with anger, but with the strange tenderness that a well-closed ending demands. He tucked the letter away in a folder for things that teach, not things that hurt, and left to meet Sophia at a corner cafe. The day after the wedding dawned quieter than Lucas expected. There was a kind of calm hovering over the house, but it wasn't the kind of peace that arrives as a gift, but rather the interval between 2 moments of intense reflection. He woke before his alarm, made coffee, and watched the steam rise from the cup as he relived the recent events. He was in no rush to decide what to think about everything, but he was certain that this chapter wasn't just about an old betrayal and an awkward reunion. Sophia's firm and calm presence contrasted with Emily's that night, and this presented him with a dilemma that had nothing to do with reconciliation, but with how he would deal with the past from then on. Holding a grudge felt too heavy, but completely erasing what had happened also felt dishonest to himself. He knew that, at some point, he would have to face a conversation with Sophia about everything that had happened. Although she hadn't asked direct questions, her sensitivity had captured every detail, and this left him torn between telling everything raw or letting silence preserve the lightness of what they were building. The moral dilemma was clear. Revealing the past completely might give Sophia the feeling that there was still something unresolved, but omitting certain aspects could seem like a lack of transparency. It wasn't just a matter of trust in the present, but of respect for the future. And, as much as he trusted her, there was a silent fear that the detailed revelation would reopen wounds that were already healing. Meanwhile, Emily remained like a distant shadow, but one that still projected its presence unexpectedly. The letter he had received haunted his mind, not because of its content, but because of the way she admitted she had chosen the cruelest path to end their relationship. This belated honesty affected him not because it created any desire for closeness, but because it left him faced with another difficult question: to what extent can a person be defined by their worst mistake? He had always believed that everyone had the right to start over, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that some actions leave scars that forever change the way we see someone. Forgiving was possible, but forgetting was another matter. In the days that followed, Lucas and Sophia maintained their routine of meeting up. They ate dinner together, took late afternoon walks, and talked about topics ranging from books to childhood memories. However, at times, his silence grew thicker, and she noticed. Sophia didn't pressure him, but one attentive look from her was enough for Lucas to know he couldn't postpone the conversation about that night at the wedding forever. He wanted to find the right moment, not a moment of euphoria or a day that was too heavy, but rather a time when they could speak unhurriedly, without interruptions, and where the words sounded not like defense, but like surrender. This wait for the ideal moment also made him reflect on his own stance. He'd always been the type of person who believed the truth should be told even if it hurt, but now he realized there's a difference between thrusting the truth at someone and delivering it in a way they can receive. The dilemma became more complex because, while he wanted to shield Sophia from details that might not add anything, he feared that omission would create room for future mistrust. This fine line between sincerity and prudence bothered him more than any other recent decision. One day, during a walk in the park, Sophia mentioned, with the naturalness of someone discussing the weather, that she had seen Emily leaving the party alone and that the image stirred a mixture of pity and curiosity. Lucas listened in silence, feeling the weight that this might be the moment he was looking for. But he decided not to delve deeper. He replied simply that it wasn't easy to see someone pay the price for their own choices, and she agreed. Her tone, however, indicated that she was open to hearing more when he felt ready. It was then that he realized the time to decide was fast approaching. At the same time, Emily began to appear indirectly in small news stories and comments from acquaintances. Not invasively, but as a name that cropped up casually, reminding her that the story was still breathing somewhere. Some people said she was distancing herself from old circles, others that she had embarked on new projects. Lucas avoided delving deeper, but deep down, he understood that each piece of news was a reminder that lives moved on, albeit on completely different paths. And this also brought him a strange sense of freedom. He no longer had to participate in her decisions, just as she no longer had influence over his. The nights became lighter after Lucas mentally decided that the conversation with Sophia wouldn't be about Emily, but about him. Not about what she did, but about what he felt, what he learned, and what changed. He realized that the moral dilemma wasn't exactly whether to tell or not, but between reliving the past or using it as a foundation for the present. This shift in perspective reassured him, as he understood he could be honest without necessarily reopening all the wounds. However, there was still one last shadow to dispel, the memory of the restaurant. The place, with its dim lights and distinctive aroma, still bothered him whenever he passed by. It was like a visual reminder of the day his world fell apart. And, in a gesture not even he expected, he decided to go back in, not to relive the pain, but to give the space a new meaning. He invited Sophia to dinner there, without giving a specific reason, and when they arrived, he asked for a different table, but in the same room. She noticed a certain weight in his gaze and didn't ask anything immediately. She simply held his hand, and Lucas felt that her simple presence was already changing the meaning of that place. As they ate, the conversation flowed smoothly, and Lucas realized that, little by little, the restaurant was no longer a symbol of betrayal and was becoming just a place. There was no longer the visual shock or the nausea he'd felt before. There was good food, company that looked at him with genuine attention, and the feeling that the past was truly behind him. When they left, the night air felt different, and he understood that the process of liberation didn't just come from forgiving or moving on, but also from facing the places and moments that once seemed untouchable. Even with this sense of progress, Lucas knew the story wasn't yet completely over. Not because there was any possibility of returning with Emily, but because certain stories leave traces that manifest themselves in subtle ways. The moral dilemma was still there, waiting to be resolved, and he felt that moment would arrive very soon, perhaps unexpectedly. Preparing for the end of this journey wouldn't be marked by major events, but by small decisions that, together, would determine how he remembered this phase of his life. In the days leading up to this resolution, Lucas reflected on what he wanted his life to be like from then on. Not just in terms of relationships, but in how he would deal with people, trust, and second chances. The climax had already shown that truth, when it arrives, has the power to destroy or liberate. Now, the falling action showed that, after the impact, one must know how to build on the rubble. And although there were still unanswered questions, he was ready to find those answers without fear of what he might hear. The end was approaching, and he knew that when it came, he would have to be ready to close the door once and for all, not with anger, but with the serenity of someone who has learned that true closure comes when the past no longer dictates the tone of the present. That night at the restaurant with Sophia had marked an intimate and silent turning point, and in the days that followed, the routine seemed to have returned to normal, albeit with clearer contours. Lucas would wake up early, stop by the bakery on the corner, leave an improvised flower in Sophia's office glass, and continue his day with a lightness that didn't border on euphoria, but rather had substance. Still, there was a conversation hanging between them, electric in the air, and he felt he couldn't prolong this interval without it becoming a distance. On Tuesday, he sent a direct message, without suspense, proposing dinner at his place, nothing ostentatious, just fresh pasta and plenty of time. She responded with a yes that sounded like an agreement, and by 8 o'clock they were face to face, the pan steaming, the wine open, the light lower than usual, as if choosing a setting that welcomes rather than intimidates. He began by talking about the recipe, the perfectly seasoned garlic, the light touch with the salt, an excuse to gather his courage, and then, during a break in the water's boil, he turned around, rested his hands on the counter, and let out what he'd been holding back. He said he needed to tell that chapter without drama, that there were places and phrases that still held weight, that he didn't want her to discover from others what he'd lived before her. Sophia carefully put down her cutlery, looked up, and said simply that she was ready to listen, that she wasn't afraid of the past if it came unmasked. Lucas recounted, not like someone dramatizing, but like someone organizing boxes. He spoke of dinner with his parents, the table next door, the gesture that leaves no doubt, the walk to the door, the silence that followed, the attempts to understand the incomprehensible, and finally, the secret Emily confessed, the calculated choice of place and time, the cowardly decision that outsourced the end of their marriage. With each passage, Sophia asked small questions that didn't intrude, but rather aligned, wanting to understand the chronology, what remained after each scene, how he breathed in the mornings that followed. When he finished, there was no lecture, no hasty advice. She leaned closer, rested her forehead against his, and said it hurt to hear him, but that it hurt in the right place, the one that heals. And she added, with a firm voice, that the trust she felt didn't depend on the size of the past, but on the quality of the present they were building. Her words lifted a burden he hadn't even realized he was still carrying, but they also brought to the surface a dilemma he'd been pushing aside. Emily had asked, in her letter, to talk to his parents, to apologize face to face for their role in the restaurant scene she'd orchestrated. Lucas wasn't sure if he should broker this meeting. He feared reopening a wound in the family, and at the same time, he realized that refusing this gesture could trap everyone in a bitter, hopeless resentment. He told Sophia this, hoping for any sign that would break him out of the impasse. She thought for a moment and replied that family forgiveness isn't organized as an event, but that if the parents wanted to hear, perhaps it would be fairer for him to simply open the door, not lead the conversation. And she concluded with a question that made him take a deep breath: to what extent would he continue to shield everyone from discomfort that was no longer his responsibility? With this in mind, Lucas called his parents and explained the situation bluntly. On the other end, there was a heavy silence, followed by his father's slow voice, saying they weren't refusing to listen to anyone, but they preferred to do so in a neutral setting, and that it wasn't up to his son to carry this encounter on his shoulders. His mother, in turn, asked only that everything be brief, without too many memories, without complaints. 2 days later, they met in a room at a community center his mother frequented. The plastic chairs, the bulletin board with dance class and donation notes, and the faint scent of thermos coffee created an unglamorous setting, precisely for what needed to happen, an apology without an audience. Emily arrived discreetly, greeted him with a restrained wave, and began speaking without holding back her words. She said she had no right to ask for anything, but that she needed to acknowledge, before them, that she had used that night to resolve her fear with a low blow, that she had turned a family dinner into a means of rupture, and that for that she regretted it in a way that went beyond the marital sphere, because she had hurt those who welcomed her as a daughter. Lucas's mother listened with an expressionless face for most of the time, and when she responded, she tried neither to be sweet nor harsh, choosing the narrow path of dignity. She said that what was done cannot be undone, that it hurt like few things hurt, but that family has no vocation for accumulating resentments, and that, if it were up to her, there would be no doors locked from the outside, as long as everyone did their job from the inside. The father, more economical, nodded, thanked them for their belated courage, and concluded with a simple request, that they not turn that encounter into a recurring memory, that they let time do what only time can do. Emily nodded, holding back tears like someone holding the steering wheel on a curve, and drove off without asking for anyone to come near her. Lucas watched from a distance, feeling like a big piece had finally found its place, not for reconciliation, but for closure. That same week, another invitation came that put Lucas's dilemma in a new light. An old friend approached him about collaborating on a volunteer mentoring project with young people in the community. It was something he'd admired from afar but had never devoted energy to. Accepting meant filling his time with something other than work and dating, reorganizing priorities, and ultimately, choosing what kind of man he wanted to be after the personal earthquake. He talked to Sophia on a park bench, and she, with a sparkle in her eyes, said that supporting this kind of choice is also a form of love. The project began on Saturday afternoons, with conversations about studying, work, and ethics, and there Lucas discovered a useful scar, the ability to talk about trust and choices without sounding preachy. One of the young men asked, in a mix of provocation and truth, if he truly believed people deserve second chances. Lucas, instead of responding with a thesis, explained, in discreet terms, that he had seen people make terrible mistakes and rise again, and that the criterion he had learned to use was not the quality of the repentant speech, but rather the consistency of behavior after the fall. The young man nodded, and that small, silent agreement had a seed-like effect. Sophia, in turn, began making small gestures that paved the way for a quiet future. She left a toothbrush at his house one random afternoon, brought a new dish towel because she found the old one boring, and stuck a fridge magnet with a silly phrase that made them both laugh. Lucas noticed these details with a gratitude that didn't require fuss. And, at a Thursday dinner, while they were choosing a movie, she brought up the subject he'd been avoiding without realizing it. She asked if he'd kept anything from the old house that still held him captive. Lucas looked at the bookshelf, at the box in the closet he avoided opening, and replied yes, that there was a ring he didn't know what to do with, not out of attachment, but out of respect for the symbol that no longer served him. Sophia listened and gently suggested that perhaps it was time to transform it into something else, not money, not oblivion, but perhaps a gesture of giving that acknowledged that love that has ended can also generate good things. The idea passed through him with the clarity of an open window. The following Saturday, Lucas took the ring to a jewelry store that supported the mentoring project, converting the piece into a microfund for scholarships. He didn't film it, didn't photograph it, didn't tell anyone but Sophia. It was a silent act, the kind that changes your bones from the inside. On the way out, he encountered Emily across the street, walking slowly, a coincidence that could have been interpreted as a provocation, but wasn't. She saw him, stopped, and for a second seemed to consider crossing. She didn't. She simply waved, a polite greeting, and continued on. There, in that restraint, lay a maturity that no apology can capture. Lucas understood that, without a formal agreement, they had established a healthy perimeter, each going their own way, without checking the other's rearview mirror. Despite the favorable developments, life still tested limits. A coworker, without malice, mentioned at lunch that he'd seen Emily at a lecture on relationships and choices, that she'd spoken about emotional responsibility frankly, without posing as a victim. Lucas listened with a strange mix of discomfort and respect. He told Sophia that evening, and, to his surprise, she smiled and said that was a good thing, that people who make mistakes and become monoliths are dangerous, that she'd prefer Emily become someone who thinks. These firm words, delivered without venom, were part of Lucas's sense of security around her. He found himself imagining the future with details he'd previously avoided: short trips, the end-of-day hug always in the same spot in the living room, the sound of silverware at Sunday breakfast, perhaps a bigger decision ahead, with no set date but direction. Then the phone rang on a rainy afternoon, and on the other end was Lucas's father, asking him to stop by. The tone wasn't urgent, but it was meaningful. When he got there, he found them both quieter than usual. The father opened the conversation by saying that Emily had written again, this time to them, not to ask for anything, but to inform them that she would be moving soon, that she would start over in another city, and that, before leaving, she would leave an envelope at the community center with a donation for the young people's language course, in their name, as recognition for the past welcome and the difficult encounter they had experienced. The mother looked at her son and asked what he thought of this, if it wasn't a way of over-cleansing himself. Lucas considered, his hand flat on the table, and replied that actions don't erase other actions, but that transforming a mistake into a helpful gesture doesn't offend him, and that forbidding help out of fear of others reading it would be a way of keeping history alive in the worst sense. The parents accepted his reasoning, and in that simple room it was agreed that no one would publicize the gesture, that the course would receive the resources and that, with that, everyone would follow a millimeter lighter. On the way home, Lucas stopped the car near a covered plaza. The rain beat down rhythmically, and the smell of wet earth brought back fond memories of recent walks with Sophia. He picked up his phone and wrote a short message inviting her for a weekend away, not far away, just enough to change the horizon. She responded promptly with a "happy birthday," and the image of the two of them on the road, music low, window ajar, filled his mind with a calm contentment. The idea wasn't to celebrate victory over anything, but to seal the new phase, reinforcing with presence what already existed in promise. On Saturday morning, they headed to a small inn tucked away among ancient trees. The room smelled of freshly polished wood, and the sound of a stream in the background accompanied the pleasant silence. They hiked trails, shared an improvised sandwich, took crooked photos, and laughed at their own faces. That night, sitting by the fireplace, Lucas decided to touch on the last remaining delicate point between them. He said that, after all this, there were still days when his body remembered the scare, not as pain, but as a warning, and that he wanted to be honest when that happened, so as not to transform shadows into monsters. Sophia listened and replied that she knew trust isn't a button, it's practice, and that she didn't expect invulnerability from him, she expected presence and truth. She added, with a sparkle in her eyes, that she too had fears, and that they would only be able to overcome them if they learned to name them without shame. This conversation, without excessive confessions and without grandiose promises, worked as a maintenance agreement. Taking care of what they were building would be a daily job, and both were willing. On Sunday, already on the road back, his phone vibrated with a short message from Emily, the first in weeks. She thanked him for meeting his parents, informed him that she was leaving on Wednesday and wouldn't be saying goodbye, and finally, simply wished him happiness, without subtext. Lucas read it aloud to Sophia, who simply said that it sounded right, a period written in legible handwriting. They smiled slightly, and the trip continued with new music, not a rehashed track. Arriving home, Lucas opened the window and took a deep breath. The city looked the same, but the air had a different density. On Monday, he would return to work, to mentoring, to late afternoon coffees, to a life that had regained its rhythm. However, in his heart, something had changed decisively. The past no longer demanded attention, no ritual, no need for captions. The final piece of the story still remained, the one that ties loosely and leaves a clear message for those who listen. Decisions have a cost and also a legacy, and love that is protected by truth flourishes where shortcuts fail. When Wednesday arrived, the morning was filled with clear skies, but there was a tension that couldn't be seen, only felt. Lucas woke up early, took a leisurely shower, and went to work like any other day, but deep down he knew that this was the day a door would close forever. Not because there was still something open between him and Emily, but because her departure for another city ended their last physical bond, the possibility of chance encounters, of crossing paths by chance on the street or at an event. It was as if fate were saying, it's time for each of them to follow not just separate paths, but roads where their names don't even appear on each other's maps. Throughout the day, he focused on work, answered emails, attended meetings, but at times his mind wandered, wondering what her life would be like away from here, if she could truly start over, if she would find peace, or if she would spend the rest of her days trying to erase a shadow that only she could face. Meanwhile, in a partially emptied apartment, Emily placed the last boxes in the corner, looking around at the walls that had once housed plans that had not come to fruition. There were no tears in that moment, but a silent heaviness, the recognition that she could blame no one but herself for what she was experiencing. She took the envelope with the donation receipt she had made to the community center's language course and placed it on the table, along with the key, as if that gesture were the most honest way to leave without leaving a trace of bitterness. Before closing the door, she took a deep breath and, for the first time in a long time, felt she owed nothing to anyone in that space, only herself, the duty of not repeating old mistakes. Lucas, upon leaving work, received a brief message from his mother, saying that the envelope had been left at the community center and was already with the course coordinator. No further comment, just the acknowledgement that the final act was complete. He didn't respond immediately, putting his phone in his pocket and heading to the meeting point with Sophia. She was waiting for him leaning against the door of a cafe, and when he arrived, there were no questions about his feelings, just a firm hug, the kind that communicates that you don't need to say everything to be understood. They went in, ordered coffee, and shared a piece of cake, chatting about trivial things, as if it were just another day, and perhaps that was exactly what he needed, normalcy. Time went on, and the weeks that followed cemented a new rhythm. Lucas intensified his participation in the mentoring project, now also helping organize lectures with outside guests. Sophia began attending some activities and became involved in parallel initiatives, creating an even stronger bond between them. There was no longer room for comparisons, for ghosts hovering, and what was being built carried the weight of real presence, not promise. He realized that, although there was no rush to formalize major steps, they were moving in the same direction without needing to confirm it every moment. Emily, on the other hand, adapted to the new city with a mixture of effort and resignation. She got a job at a small local company and rented a modest apartment. She didn't close herself off to new connections, but she avoided any involvement that strayed too close to the danger zones she already knew. She made casual friends, started frequenting a nearby library, and even volunteered on a social project, trying to keep her mind occupied and her conscience clear. Still, there were nights when the memory of what happened returned with force, not to bring her hope, but to remind her of the price she had paid. And although she didn't seek news of Lucas, she knew he was okay, and that, somehow, brought relief and pain at the same time. Time passed a few more months and brought an unexpected moment. Lucas's mentoring project was invited to participate in a regional event, and he was chosen to speak about the importance of trust and choice in youth development. The audience was filled with students, educators, and volunteers, and among the attentive faces, he noticed some curious looks when he mentioned that he had seen firsthand what a breach of trust can do to a life, but that he had also witnessed stories of legitimate new beginnings. He spoke about how trust is not something that is regained with fine words, but with the consistent repetition of correct actions. At the end, he received a standing ovation, not for his eloquence, but for the clarity and authenticity of his speech. That night, on the way home, Lucas and Sophia talked about the impact certain experiences have on how we see the world. She said she admired him for transforming a painful moment into something useful for others, and he replied that none of it would have made sense if he had completely shut himself off. He acknowledged that her presence was what kept him grounded, and that without it, he might still be stuck in the cycle of reliving the betrayal in search of answers that don't exist. Sophia smiled and said that right answers don't free us, what frees us is stopping asking the wrong questions. The cycle seemed truly complete when, one Sunday morning, Lucas received an unexpected email. It was from Emily, short and to the point. She thanked him for not objecting to the donation and said she had managed to enroll in a night school course, financed with her own salary, and that, little by little, she was beginning to feel part of something constructive. She concluded by saying she didn't expect a response, just wanted him to know she was trying to live in a way that wouldn't embarrass anyone who once believed in her. Lucas read the message, took a deep breath, and decided not to respond. Not out of indifference, but because she understood that this was a silent closing, one that didn't ask for applause or continuity. Time, as always, passed. Lucas and Sophia continued to cultivate a healthy relationship, unhurriedly, but with steady steps. They took short trips, celebrated discreet birthdays, and, most importantly, maintained the practice of talking about their feelings, even when it was uncomfortable. He knew life would still bring challenges, but now he was confident they would face them together, without resorting to dangerous shortcuts. Her presence had shown him that true love isn't made of grandiose promises, but of gestures repeated every day. Emily, for her part, consolidated her routine in the new city. She built friendships that didn't depend on secrets, learned to listen more than talk, and gradually began to be recognized for her dedication to her work. Her regret didn't disappear, and perhaps never would, but she transformed it into a kind of internal guide, a constant reminder that certain choices come at a price too high to be paid again. She lived more simply, and even though loneliness still visited her from time to time, she no longer felt it as a sentence, but as an opportunity to know herself better. The end of this story wasn't about reconciliation, but about rebuilding. Each followed a path where they could live with dignity, without harboring resentment, but also without denying the consequences of their own decisions. Lucas found a love that needed no excuses to exist, Sophia built a solid and real bond with him, and Emily learned that loyalty is a daily choice, not a fixed trait. In the end, everyone learned lessons that would shape the rest of their lives. And now, after learning about this journey full of choices, pain, consequences, and new beginnings, comment on what you thought of this story and share your opinion. Subscribe to the channel to see more intense stories like this one. Remember, betrayal destroys families, erodes love, and leaves scars that never completely disappear. Here, we do not condone any type of infidelity. May this narrative serve as a reflection on how every decision we make has the power to build or destroy everything we love.